Hello, DC fans! Today we're going to take a look at everything we know about the DCU timeline so far. Now that Peacemaker Season 2 is finished, there is a lot we learned. So, there will be at least mild spoilers for everything in the DCU so far, but as long as you're okay with that, then let's dive right in and see what we can find out. Don't forget we have an October contest running all month long. Be a subscriber, leave a comment, you could win a book or a steelbook. Best of luck! We also have a membership option with lots of cool perks, so you might check it out. Plus, hang around to the end of the video, and I'll talk about the Doomsday Countdown rewatch on the Discord. Alright, so we need to start with some ground rules given by James Gunn about what is canon in the new DCU. So, in an interview, he was asked, a lot of people are wondering, what's canon in the new DC? And he jokingly said, it's whatever we mention in anything, but actually, he's pretty correct about that. So he goes on to clarify, Peacemaker's pretty easy. Peacemaker Season 1 is basically canon, outside of the appearance of Justice League at the end, which, indeed, we did see something in Peacemaker Season 2 about that. We'll talk about that. He said the Suicide Squad is probably a little looser. We know that Rick Flag Sr. is angry because his son was killed by Peacemaker, so we know that situation happened in the past. And then here's the key. But that exists as canon because it was mentioned in Creature Commandos, not necessarily because it existed in Suicide Squad. I think of Suicide Squad and Peacemaker as pretty unreliable memories of what happened in the DCU. And that's a key term, unreliable memories. We're going to see that type of concept coming up repeatedly. Okay, so as an example, did Bloodsport truly attack Superman in the DCU canon? Remember, he's in prison for putting Superman in the ICU with a kryptonite bullet. Well, James Gunn explained it pretty simply when he was asked, did Bloodsport hospitalize David Cornsweat's Superman? And he said, no, nothing matters until we say it. So again, until it's referenced. Anything we talk about, that then becomes canon. And then he summed it up really well here when he said, only Creature Commandos forward is pure canon. Peacemaker is almost entirely consistent with that canon other than the Justice League appearance. The Suicide Squad has a lot of consistencies, but I think of it as an imperfect memory. So there's that term again, imperfect memory. And he even went on to say that the first Suicide Squad can be considered a vague memory. Nothing is canon before Creature Commandos, but you can think of those other things as vague memories of things that happened, going back even to the first Suicide Squad. So, okay, that's why I'm including even the first Suicide Squad movie as DCU canon. Not much of it is canon, but at least the concept of the movie did occur in the DCU. Okay, so now let's talk about some specifics. Is Superman Welcome to Metropolis canon? And I'll be honest, I wondered as soon as I saw this title, an official novel inspired by the film. And that just sounds a little talky, right? Like they're trying to talk around the issue and not really answer the question. But James Gunn himself clarified. So someone said, you decided your Superman movie didn't need an origin or a debut, and to great effect, but would you have any problem with it if DC wanted to produce comics to tell such stories? So he said, even with me and our guy Phil, whose job it is to keep it all together, and Phil, you're killing it, man. Phil is amazing. I want to meet this guy. Anyway, Phil is in charge of canon on the DCU, and with multiple films and shows, it's still hard to keep track of. Adding comics at this time would be too much for the lean DC team. So right now, nothing is canon outside of the film media. Uh-oh. So naturally the question is, well, what about Welcome to Metropolis prequel novel? Is that canon or is that an exception? And he says, it is not canon. No. Bummer. I thought it was a pretty good novel, honestly. So, oh well, he's literally saying it is not canon. So what about the Crypto shorts? Are those canon? I'll be honest, I was a little nervous when I saw Crypto hanging out with Clark in Metropolis and doing crazy things like splitting the Daily Planet globe in half. I mean, they're fun. They're a lot of fun to watch, but are they canon? Well, he was asked that and answered it pretty clearly. Hey, James Gunn, one question. Are the Crypto shorts canonical in DCU? And he said no. I love them, though. So there you go. The Crypto shorts are not canon either. So I just wanted to cover those up front so you know why I'm not including them in the timeline. But okay, we now have the ground rules. Creature Commandos forward is canon, and anything mentioned prior to that then becomes canon. So okay, we're going to start the timeline with Suicide Squad. I mean, I'm betting only about 5 minutes of the movie is considered canon, but still, it is part of the DCU canon. But I'm going to put these dotted red lines around anything that is basically a vague or imperfect memory. Okay, so what do we do with Suicide Squad? Well, the reason I think James Gunn is saying it's canon, at least a small part of it, is because Peacemaker Season 2, Episode 3 canonizes Rick Flag's relationship with June. So he's saying, hey, come back to bed. And of course, he's talking to Harcourt, but she says, you ship out today, you really should be with June. And then he says, well, yeah, she's a sorceress. And I'm afraid if I break up with her, she's going to burrow a hole through the planet. Now, of course, he's talking about the Enchantress, so this scene actually does two things at once. It canonizes at least a very small portion of the first Suicide Squad movie, i.e. Rick Flag's relationship with June, but it clearly tells us things went down very differently, because remember, at the end of Suicide Squad, June lost her Enchantress powers. Enchantress seemingly was dead, but in the DCU, it seems she's alive. So, okay, maybe not much of the Suicide Squad movie is canon, but we still need to put it in the timeline. So, what do we know about the movie? Well, in the opening scene, we had some files that Amanda Waller owned, and notice they give us June and also 2016. So, okay, that's perfect. And then at the end of the movie, or near the end, when the Enchantress escapes, Waller's phone actually shows us August 5th. And both of those dates align to 2016, so okay, I think we have our placement. So, Suicide Squad, the key facts are the files show June of 2016 and the phone shows August of 2016, meaning the movie runs from June to August of 2016. All right, so now let's talk about our next imperfect memory, and that is the Suicide Squad. So, James Gunn told us something very important. It takes place in the year it comes out. And he actually said that on Instagram, so here's the Instagram post where he's telling us that. So it came out in 2021, so that seems to place the movie in 2021. Well, there's only one problem. During Harley's torture scene, the executioner is texting, and if we zoom in, and actually you probably have to tilt your device, your phone, your laptop, whatever you're watching this on to be able to read it, but we get a date that translates into English as Monday, August 17th of 2020. So August 17th is a Monday in 2020, but you do have to wonder if this is when the scene was filmed, but isn't necessarily trying to indicate a timeline. Also, it is worth noting that one of the props, which wasn't shown in the actual movie, but still, props are sometimes helpful. Notice we get some information about Harley, that she was born in December of 1992, and she's now 29. Well, if you do that math, that means the movie has to be at least December of 2021 or later. So obviously we have some conflicting information. Well, before we get to the timeline placement, I do want to point out that Waller is taken down by Florence Crawley, as we can see here, when she just whacks her upside the head, and that's going to be important for later. So, okay, let's talk about our key facts. We see a phone that shows August of 2020. Gunn said it happens in 2021, and Harley's file implies December of 2021. Well, I'm going to split the baby down the middle, and I'm going to go with August because of the phone, but 2021 because of James Gunn. And actually, don't worry too much about the year, because we're going to see that it's going to move forward once we get to some later DCU entries. All right, so now on to Peacemaker Season 1, which again is a vague or imperfect memory. So what do we learn from that? Well, really, the only timeline indicator I could find is when Peacemaker in Episode 1 says he was in the hospital for 5 months, basically after the Suicide Squad. Now, I really wish we could read this invoice on the refrigerator. It's taunting me. But everything is so blurry, I can't see what it says. But if anybody has a better image of that and can tell if it has a physical date, like a month or a year, that'd be so helpful. But really, 5 months after Suicide Squad, that's about all we get. So some other important things to note is in episode number 8, Economos breaks his leg, and here we see him on a crutch, and we'll see him doing that later down the timeline as well. Also in episode 8, A.R.G.U.S publicly outs Waller. Remember, she has a press conference, says this is all part of a Black Ops program known as Task Force X. And it's worth noting that the Season 1, Episode 8 finale, where the Justice League shows up, was rewritten for the DCU in Season 2, Episode 1, when they told us, actually, it was the Justice Gang that showed up. I thought that was awesome. Really interesting to see Superman there, and in fact, Supergirl working with the Justice Gang, because honestly, from the Superman movie, it did not seem like she was a team player, but nonetheless, we know that she was at least loosely hanging out with the Justice Gang. Okay, so where do we place this on the timeline? Well, the biggest thing we learned is the 5 months after the Suicide Squad, and I'm also keeping this note in here that Economos breaks his leg. So 5 months after August of 2021 would put us in, let's say, January of 2022. So, okay, so much for that. Now, I'm also going to throw in Blue Beetle. I'm going to put it up in the upper right-hand corner, kind of in the penalty box, because no one has mentioned it yet in the DCU. I am certain it's going to end up being canon. I'm certain. But because it has not officially been referenced, it's in the penalty box. But nonetheless, where would we place it in the timeline? Well, we learned that Jaime had graduated from college. They say we're celebrating the first Reyes to graduate from college, which would put us in the May timeframe. And then we also see that a new school is opening in the fall of 2023. So that would place us in May of 2023. All right, great. So again, our facts, Jaime had just graduated, fall of 2023 sign, so May of 2023. All right, so finally, we can go on to the entries that are officially 100% DCU canon, and that begins with Creature Commandos Season number 1. So one of the key things we see Gunn doing in this season is referring back to some of those earlier entries to officially canonize them, right? So here we have Rick Flag Sr. saying, I thought Congress put a stop to all Task Force X activities since your daughter outed you. Of course, referring back to Peacemaker Season 1. And then we have a reference back to The Suicide Squad when they say that Weasel is one of the few soldiers still alive from Project Starfish in Corto Maltese. And of course, he survived that dreaded situation of him being dropped in the water even though he can't swim. In fact, speaking of, Rick Flag mentions supposedly he had a bad experience the last trip he took on this Osprey. And of course, again, that's because no one checked to see whether Weasel could swim. All right, so then we get a reference back to Rick Flag Sr. losing his son in the Suicide Squad. Waller says when he died in Corto Maltese, he died a hero. And by the way, what a jerk for her to be the one saying that when she ordered him to be killed. Oh, I can't wait till Rick Flag Sr. learns about that. But anyway, remember, he got killed by Peacemaker. What a joke, he says. All right, we also learned something very important. He lost his son about 2 years back. He passed on about 2 years back. Okay, keep that in mind. We also know that school is in session because in episode 5, Clayface is like creeping on the students, but that means obviously school must be happening. We're going to see that's very important in the timeline placement. And then we have Economos referencing his injured leg. They ask, what happened to your leg? And he says, well, I was fighting off an alien invasion. Of course, referring back to Peacemaker Season 1, but keep in mind, he's still walking around on a crutch. We'll definitely be talking about that a little bit more. Then we also have Clayface in episode 5 going all Bane on Rick Flag, breaking his back. In fact, we learn he's in a coma, his back is broken, and he seems to have suffered major internal damage. So, okay, lots of important things happen in Creature Commandos. We learned that it's about 2 years after the Suicide Squad, because that was when Rick Flag talked about his son dying. Economo still has his cane, Flag's back is broken, and school is in session. So, okay, I'm going to place it in June of 2023. June because it's during school year, and then 2023 because that is about 2 years after the Suicide Squad. So that works really well. We will see, however, that several of these entries are going to be pulled a year forward in the timeline when we get to Superman and Peacemaker Season 2. And also, poor Economos. That means it's been almost a year and a half and his leg still hasn't healed. Of course, some people, depending on their accident, their leg never heals. Or it could also be that he's pretending to still be injured to basically get attention. I wouldn't put that past Economos. All right, so anyway, on to Superman. So lots of good information here. First of all, James Gunn said that Creature Commandos is only months before Superman, because here we see him being asked basically, hey, we hear Lex Luthor might show up in Creature Commandos. And he says, no, that's not true. Lots of fun appearances, but no Lex. However, he says, Creature Commandos is only months before Superman. It's also interesting to note that Crawley is now head of the FBI. Now, I'll admit, I was a little confused when her nameplate said Director Crawley. I was like, Director of Argus, maybe? But James Gunn has clarified she's the head of the FBI. And we haven't said how exactly, but knowing she stopped Waller in Corto Maltese and Waller was outed by her daughter, we can imagine she's back in Americans' good graces. So, okay, very cool. We also see that Rick Flag Sr. appears. His back is healed, that's important, and he's listed as General Flag. Now, we will find out he is the acting head of Argus at this point, but we'll have to get to Peacemaker Season 2 to learn that. All right, so what do we learn about the timeline? Well, one important thing is it picks up 3 years after Superman comes on the scene. In fact, we get lots of interesting information with all of these opening graphics talking about 3 centuries ago. We learn about 3 decades ago. In fact, here's everything we learned from those. 3 centuries ago, the first metahumans appeared on Earth. 3 decades ago, a baby arrived on Earth. 3 years ago, Superman made his debut. 3 weeks ago, Superman stopped an invasion. 3 hours ago, the Hammer of Bravia attacked Superman. And 3 minutes ago, Superman lost his first battle. It's also worth noting that in the middle of the movie, at least, we learn that 3 months ago, Lois and Clark started dating. So really, we were just missing 3 days ago, and we would have had everything. All right, so the most important timeline indicators are actually around all of these newspapers. So they all align to May of 2025, because notice this one is Monday, May 19th, and indeed, May 19th in 2025 is a Monday. And it's also worth noting that the article tells us that Metropolis was targeted by a superpowered mystery man on Sunday. So in other words, the Hammer of Baravia attacked on Sunday, and now it's Monday. So later in the movie, we see Hawkgirl reading a newspaper, and sure enough, we learn that it is Thursday, May 22nd. And then finally, at the end of the movie, we see them reading the newspaper, and indeed, it is Saturday, May 24th. So if we put all of this together, the movie actually started on Sunday, would have been May 18th, and then we have the 19th, the 22nd, and the 24th. And this is kind of cool. Even the volume numbers work out. Notice 60,002, then 5, then 7. The only issue is the bottom lower right-hand corner. Notice there's an extra V in the volume, VLXXII, but otherwise, fantastic timeline management in the movie. All right, so let's look at everything we learned from the movie. So we have a May 25th newspaper, in fact, several of them. We know that it's only months after Creature Commandos, according to Gunn. Flag's back is now healed, and it's 3 years after Superman's debut. So we can place the movie in May of 2025. That's pretty easy. But let's talk about this only months after Creature Commandos. Well, the first thing is we've got to move Creature Commandos forward for it to be even close to what James Gunn said. So the 2023 placement is a remnant of the DCEU and its placements, so we can bring this to June of 2024. So that gets us closer. We're now 11 months difference. And it is technically only months later. I mean, it's not a full year. I doubt that's what James Gunn was meaning, but nonetheless, it kind of works. And the key is, I think we need as much time as possible between Creature Commandos and Superman for Rick Flag's back to heal, right? I mean, he got rocked in Creature Commandos. And it also needs to be during the school year, so I'm going to stick with June of 2024. Also, though, we need to pull forward these other two movies, because again, these are the DCEU timeline dates. So let's move them forward another year, bringing The Suicide Squad into 2022 and Peacemaker Season 1 into 2023. Now, I don't know that we need to bring Blue Beetle or even the original Suicide Squad movie forward a year. Maybe. I mean, tell me your thoughts on that. For now, I'm not going to do it because nothing means they have to move forward. So I'm going to leave them just like they are. Okay, so this is where we're at for now. All right, so now on to the final entry in our timeline, Peacemaker Season 2, and boy, did this season give us so much confirmation of this overall timeline. So here we go. All right, so we find out that episode 1 is happening in January because Chris mentions it's too cold outside. We can obviously see it's snowing, so he takes Eagly instead into the QUC, and in fact, we find out that Argus monitored that, and they say, remember the January thing. The Christopher Smith thing? Yeah, the glitch. Okay, so definitely we start in January. Then we jump 6 months later, which presumably would be July. And in fact, we get confirmation in episode 4 that we're still 6 months later because Chris is talking about, remember, 6 months ago, I'm screwing around in there with Eagly. So, okay, we're getting an idea really clearly that we're in July. Then I love it. We finally get a confirmation of the year because Harcourt's Mail has lots of confirmations we're in 2025. All right, so first of all, we can see from these dates that we're at least past May and even into June at a minimum. You can see June 1st, but we saw from earlier we're in July. But here's the key. This date has an April 2025 date. And here's another one where it mentions March of 2025. So, all right, we know for certain that we are in 2025 and, of course, in July. Now, this other date down here, we just kind of got to ignore. It looks like 2020. So I don't know where that thing came from. But it is worth noting that in episode 3 and in several other episodes, it looks like it's mid to late fall. I mean, the trees look like October, to be honest. But we have to ignore that. That's probably when these were filmed, but they've made it clear that we're in July. Also, there's a May 19th date in episode 3. That has to be when they sent the computer for repairs, not so much the date that it's going to be repaired, right? So we can just ignore this May 19th date. All right, so let's put in what we've learned, and that is that it is 6 months after January of 2025, which places us in July of 2025. But we'll get more confirmations of that as we go along. All right, so we also learn that the season is after the Superman movie, because they talk about the fact that it's similar to what we picked up this summer in Metropolis. Now, I will say the Superman movie is clearly in May, and May typically is not considered summer, but that's fine. We'll let that go. If they feel May is summer in the DCU, I'm fine with that. Anyway, they say the Luthor incident. Well, let's move this case to an Argus priority number 1, because the last thing we need is another dimensional rift tearing up this planet. And of course, he's talking about all the destruction in Metropolis, and in particular, this giant rift that Luthor created. Man, what a mess he made of the town. I want to know how they fixed that rift, or is it just now a giant river? Anyway, we also learned that the season is occurring specifically 1 month after the Superman movie, because in episode 8, they say you've come a long way from lambasting Luthor in this room a month ago. Of course, referring to Flag disagreeing with Luthor during the Superman movie. But then my favorite tie-in with the Superman movie is in episode number 8, when they tell us 1 month ago is the boat incident, right? When they have the big kiss, but they also tell us it's happening on May 22nd. Oh man, that is so cool, because you probably remember there was a May 22nd date in the Superman movie. So yeah, while Superman is fighting to get out of the Pocket Universe, Chris and Harcourt are off kissing on a boat. That is just so cool. And that also means that this interview that Chris gave during the Superman movie was 2 days before the boat incident, because this was happening on May 20th in the Superman movie. So I just love it. That is so cool. Okay, we also see some more ties to the Superman movie because Luthor is in prison after, of course, he was captured in Superman. They head to Belle Reve Prison, which in the Superman movie, we know that he was sent to Belle Reve. So we see that Luthor is walking around with a cane. I hope he has better medical insurance than Economos. Dude was on his crutch for like a year and a half. But yeah, Luthor got his injuries when Krypto, basically rocked him during the Superman movie. And then he says, General Flag, what an unexpected delight, and discusses the fact that he is in prison for 265 years. So yeah, totally makes sense that he would get that bad of a punishment for what he did to Metropolis. Okay. Also, we see more ties back to the Superman movie because Lex sends Flag to work with Sidney. Luthor says that's the guy, Sidney Happerstein, and of course he's an MIT super genius. And they head over to Luthor's command console, his communications hub, and we saw that in the Superman movie where he was running all his operations. Of course, there's Sidney there over on the left, and at the end of the movie, it detached itself from the buildings and now obviously has ended up there with Argus. And we see Flag has brought in the rest of Luthor's crew. There's Otis in the middle. We also get an appearance from McCoy and from Jessup. So very cool. And finally, in an interview, Gunn himself confirmed that Peacemaker Season 2 is about a month after Superman, because this interviewer says Peacemaker Season 2 takes place about a month after the events of Superman, and he says it does. Yeah. All right, so let's add that information in. It's about a month after Superman, and yeah, that works. It's probably a month and a half or maybe just 5 weeks later, but yeah, works really well, about a month after Superman. Okay, we also learned that the Suicide Squad movie was 3 years prior to Season 2, because we get this flashback from 3 years ago, and sure enough, Rick Flag Jr. is about ready to ship out to Corto Maltese in 2 hours. And then in episode 5, we get a flashback once again to 3 years ago, right after the Suicide Squad movie, when of course, Rick Flag Jr. has passed away, been killed by Peacemaker. And they mention he died fighting a giant starfish, which of course is what happened in the Suicide Squad movie. And I do have to crack up a little bit about Rick Flag Sr. trying to decide what to do with his hair. Here, obviously, it's dark. This flashback is happening before Creature Commandos, when he went gray. And then, of course, by the time we get to Superman, he goes back to black, and that's the way he also is in Peacemaker Season 2. So there are some real-world explanations for why this happened, but in universe, I'm just going to say he was trying to decide, do I go with my natural gray, or do I keep dyeing my hair? Obviously, the answer is he wants to stay jet black. All right, so now let's put in this information. It's 3 years after the Suicide Squad movie, and hey, guess what? That works perfectly. So it was a good thing that we moved this movie forward by a year, but the August timeframe still works great. All right, so then in episode number 4, we learn that Harcourt was removed from Argus after season number 1 of Peacemaker. So Flag is saying, you've been black booked, and she's like, Waller did it? And he's like, yep, on the way out the door, yeah. And she was like, I was one of 5 agents who eradicated an alien threat. Of course, referring to the butterfly incident in Peacemaker Season 1. And Flag says she needed somebody to blame for corrupting her daughter. So yeah, Waller is basically blaming Harcourt for the fact that Adebayo outed Waller at the end of Peacemaker Season 1. Too funny. Poor Harcourt. But this is the key. If Harcourt was removed from Argus after Peacemaker Season 1, then in Episode 8, it's really important when she says, try living without it, working at Argus, for 2 years like I did. Okay, so that means it's been 2 years since Peacemaker Season 1. And in fact, James Gunn himself confirmed that in an interview when he says it's been a couple years, which couple is 2, on the show since the events of the finale. Okay, so let's add that to our information. It's a couple years after season number 1, and sure enough, it is indeed a year and a half, let's say, a little less than a year and a half later. Plus, Harcourt is probably right when she said it's been 2 years since she worked at Argus, because she probably wasn't removed immediately after Peacemaker Season 1. So if we say it was 2 years after, say, April of 2023, it works perfectly. All right, so what else do we learn? Well, in episode 2, we find out that Rick Flag Sr. became the head of Argus 8 months ago. So Amanda Waller will step aside as she faces upcoming congressional hearings, and the president has appointed Rick Flag as the new acting director of Argus. Okay, great. Very helpful information. That means indeed that he was running Argus during Superman, because Superman was only a month ago and he became the head 8 months ago. All right, so let's add that in. Flag was the new Argus head 8 months ago. So this now explains why Creature Commandos has to be as early as possible in 2024. Because if Rick Flag Sr. became head of Argus 8 months prior, that would be November of 2024. Well, his back was obviously healed in that scene, so now we're only 5 months after Creature Commandos, when he got the crap beaten out of him, right? Broken back, in a coma, and then he's walking around just fine. We need as much time as humanly possible. But we also need to keep Creature Commandos Season 1 about 2 years after the Suicide Squad. So yeah, this does get a little tricky, but 5 months to heal from the broken back, that works. And again, Economos just heals really slowly or broke his leg in a way that it took a long, long time to be fixed. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about Argus, because I find this really interesting. So in episode 5, we learn that Waller was actually upset with Harcourt right after the Suicide Squad, because here we have Flag in the flashback, remember that was 3 years ago, saying, I hear Waller has it out for you. In fact, she says, yeah, she put me on some crap detail in Evergreen, Project Butterfly. So yeah, referring to Peacemaker Season 1. So basically, we learned that Harcourt felt like that was punishment, being on that assignment. Interesting. Of course, then we learned that she was black booked soon after Peacemaker Season 1, which, the 2 years that she was living without the job. Well, what's so fascinating about that is in the DCEU, she was doing fine. Here's where she showed up in Black Adam, working for Argus, obviously. And then she and Economos showed up in Shazam 2, and in fact, Economos doesn't even have his crutch in this case. So wild. On the other hand, in the DCU, we basically have Harcourt is out by the time we get to Creature Commandos, but Waller is still in charge. Then, of course, we find out Rick Flag Sr. became the head of Argus, which now we know he was in charge of Argus in Superman in this scene. They may have put General Flag, probably what he prefers, his military rank, but he was also acting director. So, okay, let's look at the 2 paths for Argus. So, The Suicide Squad and Peacemaker Season 1 happen in both the DCEU and in the DCU. So, in the DCEU, life was really great for Harcourt and even for Waller, because they're both working for Argus in Black Adam and Shazam 2. However, over in the DCU, we know that Harcourt was out by the time we get to Creature Commandos, and then Waller was out by the time we get to Superman, and then in Peacemaker Season 2, everybody's trying to get back to Argus, and then, of course, they realize now we don't want to go back there. It's corrupt, and they form checkmate at the end of the season. But isn't that wild, these 2 different paths for Argus? All right, so a couple other interesting things to talk about in Peacemaker Season 2. We get a Flag family picture. I think that's great. And then we get tons of references in Episode 4 back to previous entries. So Creature Commandos is mentioned when Flag says, hey, kid, and she's like, heard you were injured a while back. And he's like, yeah, broke my back. Of course, he's referring to Creature Commandos. Then we get a reference to The Suicide Squad when he says, you remember what you told me after the funeral? And she's like, yeah, at the end of the day, Smith killed your son because Waller ordered him to. And in fact, he died in The Suicide Squad. And then we get a reference to both Creature Commandos and the Suicide Squad in a combo because Flag says, yeah, me in Pakistan and you and Ricky in Corto Maltese, we all defied Waller's orders when she went too far. So, of course, he's referring to in Creature Commandos when he said, are you telling me the United States is now in the business of executing people for crimes they haven't committed yet? So he defied Waller here. And, of course, they defied Waller in the Suicide Squad when they whacked her upside the head. So, yeah, very cool. And then we also get this flashback, which doesn't really help us with the overall timeline that much, but it's still really interesting. It was 35 years ago that they discovered this little alien, buck-naked alien, right, and his portal-making device. And of course, that's how they discovered the QUC, and that becomes a really important part of both Peacemaker Season 1 and 2, and going forward with Planet Salvation. I mean, this was a big deal in that regard. All right, one other timeline thing. In episode 8, we do get a 1 week later time jump to when they start partying on the boat with Foxy Shazam this time around. And then, of course, they form Checkmate, right? And which is going to be important for the future. And, of course, Peacemaker got thrown into the Planet Salvation where he is left stranded. So, okay, this, I think, really works well. I will give huge credit to Gunn for pulling together a timeline when basically, he was pulling things from the DCEU and the DCU, mushing them together, and we were all a little worried, but man, I really think it came out perfectly. Okay, so now I want you to let me know your feedback on the timeline. Number 1, do you think I got it right, or are there any changes I should make? But also, how do you think in general Gunn is handling the timeline? I am very impressed. So leave your thoughts. You know I love to read and respond to all of them. Plus, don't forget, October contest, be a subscriber, leave a comment, win a book or a steelbook, and there's the membership option in case you're interested in that. And I always love to mention the Discord. Here we are in the DC Timeline section talking about, well, obviously, how to make all this fit in the timeline. Plus, I promised I would mention the Doomsday Countdown rewatch. Every day listed here at 7 p.m. Eastern. We'll watch a different movie or show as we head towards the December 18, 2026 release of Doomsday. So we have 2,400 members across the globe, conversations 24/7, and I'll leave a pinned comment so you can join. Also, if you don't mind, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we'll all eagerly await the next exciting entry in the DCU.